and I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks very much to the organisers of the conference. Despite the attractions of Kent, and there are many, it's always nice to come back to Galway, even in the rain and the sleet. My subject, as Charles said, is policing. And as you know, indeed, as was ably pointed out by Conor, policing doesn't appear, as indeed criminal justice infrastructure, doesn't appear at all in the 1916 proclamation. I think, mind you, that I can draw some straws or some connections between the proclamation and policing, but I'm not going to. I'm determined to avoid getting shot by Charles's gun. So I'll move on to the subject. What I'm really going to talk about is policing over the past 100 years in Ireland. And for me, there's very few subjects that are more important than policing in the birth and development of Ireland as an independent state. It was very much at the heart of distrust, resentment, opposition to British rule. It was at the heart of the reconstruction of government and national identity in the new state, and it has always played a pivotal role in shaping that new state and securing its stability and character ever since. And of course, as we all know, at least for the past 2 decades, it has never been far from the headlines, usually for all the wrong reasons. But what I want to focus on today is how the Garda Síochána was shaped by a process of continuity and change from the old state to the new state. And in particular, I'm going to focus on how that's been reflected in central government control in policing over the past 100 years. And then I'll conclude by offering a few thoughts on whether that history is about to change, and perhaps change utterly, in the wake of the establishment of the new police authority. So first, I'll start with a few comments on the key characteristics of policing pre-independence. As I'm sure most of you know, outside of Dublin and Belfast, the whole country at that time was policed by the Royal Irish Constabulary, which was a single national force under the control of the central political administration in Dublin. It was armed, it was structured on the basis of military ranks, and it was based in barracks distributed throughout the country. Strangely, it seemed to combine the role of a civil police force drawn from the people with that of a paramilitary force imposing security on those very same people on behalf of a colonial administration. It was a type of national gendarmerie and stood in marked contrast to the local and consensual policing arrangements that were believed to exist in England at that time. And given the colonial function of the RIC, it was always inevitable that it was going to be replaced in the new republic envisioned by the 1916 proclamation. And yes, there can be little doubt that the look and the feel of its replacement in the Garda Síochána were significantly different. It was a completely new force with a new legal basis. The new recruits came from the core of the community up and down the country to serve in an Indigenous police force under the authority, critically, of an Indigenous government elected by the people. And from its very early beginnings, its most influential Commissioner, Owen O'Duffy, promoted an image and reality of the force as being in the local community, from the local community, and the backbone of the local community. And that included shaping the force with a very distinctive Catholic, Gaelic, manly image, and projecting it as a visual representation of the proud, independent Irish state. And equally significant was the fact that the force was unarmed and committed to the ideology of policing by consent. And I would argue that those aspects were instrumental in forging that close bond between the Garda and the people that has proved to be one of its most enduring strengths. But there's another side. an aside that can be summed up perhaps under the heading of continuity. And this draws very much, in fact, on what Conor was talking about with respect to the jury. Underneath that facade of rebirth, community allegiance, identity and consent, the centrally controlled gendarmerie of the RIC lurked in plain sight. Just like the RIC, the Garda was a national force under central government control. Indeed, it exceeded the RIC in this aspect as it very quickly became the sole national police force. It was also structured on the RIC paramilitary model, with the classic pyramid structure tapering up to a police chief at the top under the control, under the administrative and political control of central government. It too was distributed throughout the state in a control network just like that of the RIC. It was subject to a uniform, rigid, military-type discipline regime. It had an armed wing, which has grown substantially over the years. And perhaps most critical of all, its civil policing remit was combined with a central state security function. The Garda Síochána was not just a civil police force. Unusually for common law democracies, it was also the primary domestic state security agency. Interestingly, commentators typically have tended to contrast the Garda Síochána with the Royal Ulster Constabulary in Northern Ireland. And of course, the RUC was readily identified as a direct descendant of the RIC. But if you stripped away the political and religious identities, you would find that the Garda and the RUC were virtually indistinguishable, at least in respect of the core elements of governance, structure, and functions. These cross-currents of continuity and change from the RIC to the Garda were reflected in the governance structures of the new police. Superficially, it appeared that the force would be independent of government. The legislation conferred the general direction and control of the force on the Garda Commissioner, not on the Minister for Justice or on anyone else, purely and exclusively on the Garda Commissioner. The Commissioner, however, was appointed by the government and was removable by the government. He was not statutorily independent, and he was answerable to the government through the Department of Justice. Critically, control over the Garda budget also lay with the Department of Justice. At least up until 2005, the Secretary to the Department of Justice, not the Garda Commissioner, was the accounting officer for the force. Moreover, powers of appointment to and removal from senior ranks all the way down to the middle management levels were in the hands of the government, not the Commissioner. And there can be little doubt, therefore, in addition to that, regulatory powers over all aspects of structure, size, recruitment, education, training, appointments, management, pay, conditions, representation, and so on were vested in the Minister for Justice. And if you add all those things together, there can be little doubt that the Garda was established as an agency of the executive government and ultimately a tool for the implementation of government policy and priorities. And that was reflected in what Kevin O'Higgins said in the Dáil when introducing the establishment legislation, and I quote, "As I emphasised when the temporary bill was before the Dáil, this force is not local, but is a national force, and it is therefore essential that it should not exist outside the authority of the Executive Council, in which is vested all the delegated power and authority of the people." Now, one of the essential benefits of that arrangement, as indeed was trumpeted by O'Higgins himself, is that it would render the Garda democratically accountable to the people through their political representatives. And yet, on most occasions, when those same representatives sought to secure accountability for controversial Garda operations or poor performance, they were stymied by the Minister for Justice, hiding behind a mantra of Garda operational independence. The Minister would effectively refuse to take responsibility for Garda operations, saying that they were a matter for the Garda authorities. He or she would then go on to convey to the Dáil a bland and uninformative communication from the Commissioner on whatever matter had been raised. And that communication, of course, could not be probed or followed up, as the Commissioner was not there to answer for the Garda performance. In other words, there was at the very least a major grey hole, if not a black hole, in external Garda accountability. So, is all that about to change now, 100 years later, with the establishment of an independent police authority? Well, potentially the police authority heralds a brand new dawn in the delivery of policing and in the supervision and accountability of policing by citizens independent of both police and government. In other words, the police authority could operate as an effective buffer between Garda and government, protecting policing against the demands of political expediency, preventing the operation of a cosy relationship between the Garda and the government, and generally ensuring that the Garda are transparently and efficiently accountable for appropriate standards of performance. Well, if the police authority was actually to function in that manner, then it would truly herald a fundamental and unprecedented change. One would expect, therefore, that its design and function would be preceded by a lengthy public debate. And one would expect that that debate would be informed by full and transparent research and a close examination of the successes and failures of comparable models in other jurisdictions. But as we all know, that's not what happened here. Instead, the police authority initiative was pulled like a rabbit out of a hat by a government desperately looking for a politically expedient response to the latest Garda scandal. Its design and function were conceived from within the Department of Justice, with no independent input that I'm aware of. And given that the establishment of the police authority would mean a significant dilution in the power and influence of its supreme architect, the Department of Justice, you would not need to be a clairvoyant to suspect that the proposed police authority would be more about appearance than substance. And in my view, a close reading of the legislation suggests that those fears have been realised. Superficially, it would appear that there is real substance to the police authority. Yes, the ordinary members are appointed by government, but there are significant independent checks and balances in the procedure. Also, the authority is given a role in the appointment to and removal from senior management ranks in the Garda. It also has a significant role in setting annual policing plans, 3-year strategy statements, and Garda priorities. It can require reports from the Commissioner on policing services matters. It also has a lead role in the formulation of a code of policing ethics, including procedures for promoting compliance and reporting wrongdoing. And from a distance, all that seems very impressive. But a closer reading of the legislation suggests that all is not what it appears. Firstly, the appointments procedure to the police authority is not as independent as it may appear. The chairperson is and always will be a purely political appointment. Secondly, the authority's remit does not extend to state security aspects of policing. These remain the exclusive competence of the Commissioner and the Minister. And a big problem with that is that, as you might expect, state security is given a very broad definition, thereby putting some of the potentially most controversial issues beyond the reach of the authority altogether. Thirdly, on the key issue of the appointment of the Commissioner, the authority only nominates. The power of appointment still resides with the government. Yes, the Police authority does have a more direct role in appointments to and removal from other senior ranks, but those powers have yet to be commenced. Fourthly, most other powers that the authority possesses with respect to the policing plans, the policing strategies, and the policing priorities, they're expressly exercisable only with the consent or approval of the Minister. So the Minister still retains ultimate control. And nowhere is that more vividly illustrated than with respect to directives. Unlike the Minister, the police authority has no power to issue a directive to the Commissioner on any aspect of policing services. The most it can do is recommend to the Minister that she issues a directive. And should the Minister do that, she'll keep the police authority informed of steps taken by the Commissioner in compliance with the directive. In other words, the power is carefully calibrated to ensure that there's no sense in which the Commissioner is even seen to be subordinate to the police authority in what she does. The real power relationship remains that between Minister and Commissioner. Equally significant is the fact that the Minister can issue directives to the police authority on any matter relating to its functions and policing services. And the police authority must comply with any such directive and inform the Minister of the steps that it has taken in compliance. That leaves little room for doubt that the establishment of the police authority is not meant to displace the familiar political and constitutional power structure that has prevailed in policing here for the past 100 years. Fifthly, and critically, the police authority has no budgetary competence with respect to the force. That remains within the exclusive competence of the Commissioner and the Department. The authority is effectively frozen out. And without budgetary competence, it lacks real tools to shape Garda policy and practice. It can't even determine what equipment the Garda can and cannot have. It cannot determine Garda numbers, the establishment of specialist units, the adoption of strategies or operations with budgetary implications, and so on. All of these remain the preserve of the Commissioner and the Department, with the authority being confined to making representations or persuasion. Significantly, the legislation does not confer the authority with a general statutory responsibility to maintain an adequate, efficient and effective police service. I see you're going to shoot me, are you? At best, it's given a number of discrete powers and functions that may enable it to influence aspects of the delivery of policing services. And these are mostly in the context of street crime, low-level public disorder and antisocial behaviour. It can look to the cooperation of the Garda Commissioner to pursue those ends, and it can procure relevant reports from the Garda Commissioner. It's very telling, however, that nowhere does the legislation... I'm almost there, Charles. Just one minute. Don't shoot me again, please. It's very, very telling that nowhere does the legislation render the Commissioner expressly accountable to the police authority for the delivery of policing services. It's not even stated that the Commissioner or other senior officers must appear before the authority when requested. By contrast, the legislation does state expressly that the Commissioner is accountable to the Minister for the performance of her functions and those of the Garda. So, my conclusion is that the authority will be able to talk, and it will be able to push for certain policing strategies, priorities, policies, practices and standards, and it will have functions in respect of appointments and removals. And I guess that is some sort of progress, and it does represent some dilution of central government hegemony over policing. But when the authority's wishes come up against the immovable forces of the Commissioner and the Minister, they are doomed to failure. Ultimately, I fear that the authority will prove to be little more than a token concession to the demands of policing to be brought from underneath the blanket of the Department of Justice and exposed to the glare of transparent public governance and accountability. There's even a risk that it will prove to be little more than a cheerleader for the status quo in policing, much like the old police authority in Northern Ireland of many years ago. Yes, the actual members themselves can make a difference, but from where I'm standing now, it looks to me that despite everything that they might do, 100 years of central government control over policing in Ireland is set to continue in substance, even if it appears there has been a change of form. Thanks very much.